My youngest daughter called me at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in February, and the first thing she said wasn't hello. Mum, don't turn on any lights. Go to the basement right now and lock the door from the inside. Don't let anyone hear you moving. I was still half asleep, holding the phone the wrong way, the cold of the bedroom pressing through the window. Nora? I said. What's happening? There's no time. Please just go. Don't tell Marcus. Don't say a word to anyone in that house. Then the line went quiet, but she hadn't hung up. I could hear her breathing. I did what she told me. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years teaching grade 4 and grade 5 at Riverside Elementary in Peterborough, Ontario. I have planted the same vegetable garden in the same backyard for 22 years. I made my husband's favorite butter tarts every Christmas until the year he passed, and then I kept making them because the smell of brown sugar and pastry still made me feel like he was somewhere nearby. I am not a woman who hides in basements in the middle of the night. I am not a woman who has enemies. But I crept down those stairs in the dark, one hand on the wall, heart going too fast for a woman my age, and I locked myself in the basement and sat on the cold concrete floor behind the old chest freezer. And through the ceiling above me, I heard footsteps I recognized. My son-in-law Marcus was awake. My name is Diane Okafor. My late husband was Emmanuel, and together we had 3 children. Our oldest, Patrick, is 41 now, an electrician in Thunder Bay, with 3 kids of his own. Our middle child, Sandra, is 38, and she runs a small alterations shop in Barrie. And our youngest, Nora, is 34, and she is a paralegal who works for a family law firm in Mississauga. Emmanuel passed 4 years ago, in the spring. Pancreatic cancer. We had 6 months between the diagnosis and the end, and he used every one of those months, deliberately finishing things, saying things, making sure I knew where everything was. He was that kind of man. Careful, thorough. He left me a house with no mortgage, a life insurance policy, an RRSP, and a binder he'd organized himself with every document I would ever need, labeled in his handwriting that always slanted slightly upward at the end of each line, like he was optimistic even in his penmanship. I was devastated when he died, but I was not helpless. I want to be clear about that. I had my routines. I had my neighbors, my book club, my garden. I had my children, who called regularly and visited when they could. I was lonely in the way that any person is lonely after 40 years beside someone, but I was not lost. The trouble started 14 months before that phone call. It started, as I now understand these things often do, with something that looked like love. Sandra and Marcus had been having difficulties. I knew that much Sandra had mentioned, carefully, that things had been strained, that Marcus had lost a contract with the company he'd been doing renovation work for, that money was tight. They had a condo in Barrie that was proving expensive to maintain. I didn't press for details. Sandra had always been private, the quiet middle child who processed things internally and only shared when she was ready. Then one Sunday afternoon in December, Sandra came to visit alone. She brought a lasagna and a bottle of red wine, and we ate together at the kitchen table, and she said, quietly, halfway through her second glass, "Mum, would you ever think about having us come stay with you for a while, just until Marcus gets back on his feet?" I looked at my daughter. She had dark circles under her eyes that the wine couldn't soften. Her nails, which she'd always kept neat, were bitten down. I thought about Emmanuel's binder in the filing cabinet and the empty side of my bed and the way the house felt like it had too many rooms now. "Of course," I said. "Come home." They moved in 3 weeks later, the week after Christmas. It seemed natural. Marcus carried boxes and installed a new light in the upstairs hallway that had been flickering since October. Sandra reorganized the kitchen in a way that was slightly different from how I'd always kept it, but still logical. The dog they'd brought, a large, energetic retriever named Biscuit, filled the house with noise that I hadn't realized I missed. For the first month, it was genuinely lovely. The shift was gradual. That's the part I've spent the most time thinking about since, because I keep trying to identify the exact moment, the specific day or conversation where something changed, and I can't. There was no moment. There was just a slow accumulation of small things, each one individually reasonable, that added up to something I didn't recognize until I was already inside it. Marcus began handling things around the house, repairs, which made sense given that it was his trade. But then he started handling the mail, bringing it in and sorting it on the counter. And I noticed that sometimes envelopes were already opened when he handed them to me, and he'd say he'd been checking for anything urgent. He said it casually, as though this were a normal thing, and I let it pass. Then he began going with me to appointments. My family doctor retired in the spring, and I'd been assigned to a new clinic, and the first time I went, Marcus offered to drive. He sat in the waiting room. The second time, he came into the exam room with me, and when Dr. Vance, who was young and harried and managing a large caseload, asked if I was comfortable with Marcus present, Marcus answered for me. He said I'd been having some memory difficulties, that the family had been concerned. I told Dr. Vance that I hadn't noticed any memory difficulties. Marcus laughed warmly. "Mum, you forgot to take your thyroid medication 3 days in a row last month. We had to start managing it for you." This was partially true. I had forgotten twice, not 3 times. And the reason I'd forgotten was that the medication had been moved from the shelf in the bathroom cabinet, where it had been for 4 years, to a different location in the kitchen, because Marcus had reorganized the bathroom cabinet to make space for his things. But I didn't say that in the exam room, with the young doctor looking at me with a kind, neutral expression that I would later recognize as the expression people use when they've already decided what to believe. After that visit, Sandra started bringing me my pills in the morning. A small white cup, arranged neatly, thyroid medication, plus 2 others, a blue capsule that Dr. Vance had apparently added based on the appointment notes something for anxiety, Sandra explained, and a beige one that Sandra said was a new vitamin supplement, something for cognitive support. I asked to see the bottles. Sandra said she'd put them in the medicine organizer already, and it was easier to just take them from the cup. I took them from the cup. I cannot tell you exactly when I started feeling different, because the feeling was not dramatic. It was more like a volume being slowly turned down. I was tired in a way that sleeping didn't fix. I found it harder to follow long conversations. I started misplacing things, my reading glasses, my keys, and each time I mentioned it, Marcus or Sandra would nod sympathetically and use the word confusion in a tone that was gentle but cumulative, building a case word by word. My book club friends called, and I would be in the middle of talking when the thread of what I was saying simply disappeared, and I'd have to say I was tired and would call back. And sometimes I wouldn't call back because I'd forgotten. Nora called every Sunday. I could tell she was worried, though she was careful not to say so directly. She asked how I was eating, whether I was sleeping, whether I was getting outside. She asked once, delicately, whether I was happy having Sandra and Marcus in the house. I said yes, because I believed it, because I couldn't see yet what was being built around me. Patrick called less frequently. He was busy with his family, with work. When he did call and asked how things were, Marcus often happened to be nearby, and I noticed I was careful about what I said in a way I couldn't fully account for. It was my neighbor Celeste who first made me stop and look. Celeste Tremblay had lived next door for 16 years. We shared a fence, a recipe for potato leek soup, and the long, comfortable friendship that develops between women who have shoveled each other's driveways and sat on each other's porches through different seasons of life. In June, 7 months after Sandra and Marcus moved in, Celeste knocked on the back door, and I was genuinely startled to see her, because I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd spoken to her. It had been months. She looked at me with an expression I didn't understand at first. Careful. Searching. "Diane," she said, "I've been worried about you. I called twice and Sandra said you were resting. I'm sorry to just show up." I told her I was fine. I told her I'd just been a bit tired. She looked past me into the kitchen, and Marcus appeared from the hallway. "Celeste," he said, warmly, "good to see you. Mum's actually due for her afternoon rest soon. Her doctor has her on a pretty strict schedule right now. But we'll have her call you this week." He put a hand on my shoulder. Celeste smiled back at him, but I watched her eyes, and her eyes didn't match her smile. After she left, I sat in the living room for a long time. I thought about the phone calls I hadn't made. I thought about the mail I hadn't read. I thought about Emmanuel's binder in the filing cabinet, a filing cabinet that had been moved 6 months ago into the storage room downstairs because Marcus had needed the office space for his work, which made sense, except that I hadn't been down to the storage room since, and I hadn't asked why. I tried to go to the storage room that afternoon. The door was locked. Marcus, when I asked, said the latch had been sticking, and he'd put a padlock on to keep it closed properly until he could fix it. He said it with the same easy, confident tone he used for everything, the tone that made each individual thing sound completely reasonable. He said he'd get me the key later. He never got me the key. Nora came to visit unannounced in late August. She drove the 2 hours from Mississauga on a Saturday morning without calling ahead, which was not like her, and when I opened the door and saw her standing on the porch with a coffee in each hand and her work bag on her shoulder, I started crying in a way that surprised me, because I hadn't known until that moment that I'd been lonely. We sat in the garden and talked for 2 hours while Marcus took the dog on an extended walk that seemed to grow longer as time passed. Sandra was at work. Nora asked me where Emmanuel's binder was. She asked it directly, without preamble. I told her about the filing cabinet being moved, the padlock. She was quiet for a moment. "Has anything been signed recently, Mum? Any papers? Anything to do with the house or finances?" I thought. My memory had been unclear for months, but I thought hard, and I remembered a form, sometime in May or June, on a Wednesday morning. Marcus had put it on the kitchen table and said it was a financial management form, something the bank needed to update my records since Emmanuel's death. He'd had a pen ready. I'd been tired that morning, the deep, foggy tiredness that came and went in waves, and I'd signed where he indicated. Nora's face didn't change, but her hand, resting on the garden table, tightened. She left that afternoon with photographs of the prescription bottles she'd found in the kitchen cabinet. She'd asked Marcus for them politely, explaining she wanted to cross-check them with my original prescriptions, and he'd produced them without visible hesitation, apparently confident. She photographed everything. She was a paralegal. She knew what to look for, and, more importantly, she knew what questions to ask and who to ask them to. What she found, over the following 6 weeks, was methodical and deeply premeditated. The blue capsule Sandra had been giving me daily, described as anxiety medication, was a sedative prescribed not through Dr. Vance but through a walk-in clinic in Barrie, where Marcus had taken me once for a checkup while Sandra was working. A clinic where Marcus had again accompanied me into the exam room. The beige capsule, described as a cognitive supplement, was not a supplement at all. It was a medication prescribed for a condition I had never been diagnosed with, one whose side effects included confusion, fatigue, and short-term memory impairment. I had been taking medication designed to make me appear confused, prescribed by a doctor who had seen me once for 15 minutes in the company of the man who stood to benefit from my confusion. The document I had signed in June, the one Marcus called a bank update form, was a power of attorney, limited in scope but real. It had been prepared by a notary in Barrie, not by anyone I knew or had chosen. Marcus had used it, twice, to access a joint investment account Emmanuel and I had maintained for the eventual renovation of the house. $46,000 had been moved, and in the storage room behind the padlock, which Nora had a locksmith open while Marcus was out on a Tuesday, was Emmanuel's binder. Inside it, several pages were missing, the pages that had listed account numbers, the life insurance policy details, and the deed to the house. In their place were photocopies of a market appraisal for the property, and a draft agreement with a real estate company. They had been planning to sell my home. The house Emmanuel and I had bought in 1997, the house where I'd raised 3 children, the house with the vegetable garden and the butter tart smell at Christmas. Nora took everything she'd found to a lawyer the following week. The lawyer contacted the appropriate financial institutions and put flags on all accounts connected to my name. She also contacted the Ontario Provincial Police, which is why, on a Tuesday in February, at 2 in the morning, my youngest daughter called me and told me not to turn on any lights. The officers arrived at 5:30 in the morning. There were 2 OPP vehicles and a plainclothes officer from the Financial Crimes Unit in Peterborough who had been working the file for 3 weeks, since Nora had submitted the documentation. I heard the knock from the basement. I heard Marcus's voice, confident at first, then different. I heard the tone change in the way that tones change when a person realizes that the thing they thought was under control is not. I came upstairs when Nora came to the basement door and said it was safe. Sandra was standing in the hallway in her robe, and when she saw me, when she looked at me and understood that I had known, that Nora had known, that it had all come undone, she said my name. Not Mum. My name, Diane, as if she'd forgotten what I was to her. I didn't say anything. There was nothing I wanted to say. Marcus was taken into custody that morning. The legal process that followed was neither fast nor simple, these things never are, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not sat in a lawyer's office for many hours reviewing financial disclosures. There were hearings. There were delays. There was a point, around the 8-month mark, where I had to give a statement to investigators that required me to recount, in detail, every medical appointment I had been taken to, every document I had been asked to sign, every conversation I could remember about money. It was exhausting. It was also, in a strange way, clarifying, because the act of saying it clearly, in order, made me see how complete the plan had been, how long it had been running, how much of my apparent decline had been deliberate. Sandra cooperated with the investigation. Her cooperation was partial and strategic. As I understand it, she maintained for some time that she had not known about the medications, that she'd believed Marcus when he said the prescriptions were legitimate, that she'd trusted him. Whether this was entirely true, I still don't know. I have thought about it in the long, quiet hours that are a feature of my life now, and I have not arrived at a clean answer. What I have arrived at is this: that love for a spouse can become a kind of blindness, and that blindness chosen and maintained in the face of evidence is still a choice. Sandra received a conditional sentence. She is on probation. She completed a financial restitution agreement for her portion of the funds. We have not spoken since the sentencing, and I have not decided yet what that means for the future. Marcus was convicted on 4 counts, including financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a charge that carries real weight under Ontario law, fraud over $5,000, and administering a noxious substance. He received 6 years. The Crown had pushed for more, and many people in my life felt the sentence was inadequate. I understand that feeling. I am not certain I share it. 6 years is not nothing. And the conviction itself, the public record of what he did, the undeniable documentation of every step that matters to me in a way that is hard to explain. It is a form of proof. It says, this happened. It says, someone saw it. The $46,000 was recovered. The property was never transferred. Emmanuel's house is still mine, with the vegetable garden that I planted again in the spring, a little late that year, but in the same beds, in the same order tomatoes along the south fence, beans on the teepee frames Emmanuel built from cedar poles in the early years when the kids were small enough to duck under the leaves and hide. I take no medications now except the thyroid prescription I have managed myself for 12 years. My cognition returned to normal within 6 weeks of stopping what I had been given. My book club knows the full story. Celeste brought me soup in March, the good potato leek, and sat with me for most of an afternoon. Nora calls every Sunday, and I always answer. Patrick took time to understand what had happened. Men of his generation and temperament sometimes need longer to accept that the scaffolding of a normal-seeming situation was rotten from the inside. He got there. He drove down from Thunder Bay in November with his kids, and his eldest, who is 13 now, and serious-faced and curious about everything, asked me what I would do differently, and I thought about it honestly before I answered. I told her. I would have kept my own space more fiercely. I would have been more suspicious of the first inconvenience that was framed as help. I would have trusted the feeling, the small, dismissible feeling I'd had as early as February of that year when I noticed the mail had been opened rather than filing it away as something I was imagining. I want to say something here that I say not to frighten anyone, but because I believe it is true and important, and not said loudly enough. Elder financial abuse is among the most underreported crimes in Canada. The Canadian Centre for Elder Law and the Ontario Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse have both documented this for years. Most victims never report. Most incidents involve family members. Most begin not with threat or force, but with incremental access moving in, helping with appointments, offering to manage paperwork. Each step looks like care. The pattern is so consistent that researchers have named it the slow acquisition of trust, followed by the systematic removal of autonomy. If someone close to you, family member, friend, caregiver, is slowly becoming the only person who knows what your finances look like, that is not care. That is access. If decisions about your medical care are being made in rooms where you are present, but not truly consulted, that is not concern, that is control. If you find yourself unable to easily reach the documents that detail what you own, what you've signed, and who has the right to act on your behalf, that is not disorganization, that is a warning. Emmanuel always said that a person who organizes your paperwork for you, without you, in a language you can't follow, is not helping you. He said it about contractors, but he could have said it about anyone. I keep his binder now on the kitchen table, where I can see it from my chair. All the pages are restored. I have added new ones, a clear record of every account, every document, every person who has any legal standing to act on my behalf. I have given copies to Nora, to Patrick, to my lawyer, and to Celeste, who keeps hers in a kitchen drawer and checks in with me every Thursday over the fence. I am 67 years old. I am not easily frightened, but I will tell you plainly that there was a version of this story that did not end the way this one did, a version in which Nora waited one more month before driving unannounced to Peterborough, in which I signed another document or two, in which the house was listed and I was moved somewhere I had not chosen and could not leave. That version was very close. It was close enough that I have stood in the garden on early mornings and thought about it long enough to feel it. Then I go inside and make my tea and call Nora and tell her the tomatoes are looking good. That is enough. That is more than enough.